Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Santa Clara County Supervisor Joe Simitian, and this is the first of three panel discussions in our series, Understanding the Asian American and Pacific Islander Experience. I'm very pleased to be co-sponsoring the series with Asian Americans for Community Involvement, also known as AACI. And let me offer a special thanks to Sarita Kohli, AACI's president and CEO, and to her entire team for their collaboration, along with the many supporting organizations from the community who have been joining us in this effort during Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Before we get too far into the event, I should mention that if you'd like to listen to this evening's panel in another language, please click on the interpretation symbol at the bottom of your screen and choose from the available languages, which are based on the registrations we've received as of today. And if you want to continue in English, you should be good to go and don't need to do a thing. Let me also say right now, I very much hope that you'll join us for our next two Understanding the Asian American and Pacific Islander Experience programs. They're coming up on Thursday, May 20th and Thursday, May 27th. The purpose of tonight's panel is to begin to understand who's who in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. I think we're lucky to live in one of the most diverse places in the country, but without understanding the diverse communities and cultures amongst us, understandably, misconceptions abound. So our goal over the course of these next few weeks is to foster a greater understanding of our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, and our classmates. And tonight, we'll explore the similarities and differences across cultures, generations, and birthplaces that many of us may not know or fully understand and appreciate. As I say, the start of the conversation is to ask the question, who's who in our Asian American and Pacific Islander community? What are their histories, their stories, and their experiences? What are their similarities and what are their differences? And to help us answer these questions, we have three really remarkable panelists with us tonight who will share their expertise, their experience, and their point of view. And I should just say at this point, their views, their values, and their comments are their own, of course, and do not necessarily reflect the views, values, and opinions of the organizations where they work and serve, or of my office, or of me. I suspect that like many of you, I'll agree and disagree with some of what we hear tonight. And please, if I press a point or offer a thought-provoking question, including questions from our audience, I'll ask that you remember it simply to ensure a candid and illuminating conversation. And now I'd like to introduce our three panelists. First, we have Dr. Natalie Masuoka, who is the Associate Professor and Chair of the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA here in California. She's published two books on racial politics and multiracial identities, The Politics of Belonging, Race, Public Opinion, and Immigration, and Multiracial Identity and Racial Politics in the United States. Professor Masuoka, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're also very pleased to welcome Dr. Pawan Dhingra, who is a professor of American Studies at Amherst College and the president-elect of the Association of Asian American Studies. Professor Dhingra is the author of numerous books as well, including Managing Multicultural Lives, Asian Americans and the Challenge of Multiple Identities, and his most recent book, which has a marvelous title, Hypereducation, Why Good Schools, Good Grades, and Good Behavior Are Not Enough. I should note that Professor Dhingra is joining us from the East Coast, so we aim to conclude on time and let him get a good night's rest after tonight's panel. Professor, thank you for joining us as well. And our third panelist is Michele Liu, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Health Trust here in Santa Clara County, and who previously served for more than a decade as the President and CEO of Asian Americans for Community Involvement, our friends at AACI. On a personal note, I should also share that Ms. Liu served as my district director for more than 4.5 years when I was in the State Assembly and the California State Senate, and for that I say thank you again, Ms. Liu, and welcome. Again, the panelists' views are their own, and as I mentioned, we're hoping to spark a really lively give and take, genuine conversation, and your questions are key to making that happen. So my thanks to those of you who already submitted questions and comments in advance, and after I've asked a few opening questions for context, we'll turn to your audience questions. I want to get as many as I possibly can into the conversation tonight, so please type your questions in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And if you'd like to submit it anonymously, you can certainly do that. There's an option there that allows that as well. We will not be using the raise hand function. Wanted to let you know that so you didn't wait in frustrated silence. And for those of you who are viewing via Facebook, please just type your question into the comment box. We'll be tracking those questions as well. So that's about it for now. Let's dive in. Panelists, we hear people talk about the Asian American community, not always clear who or what they're talking about when they toss that term into the mix. We sometimes hear folks talk about the East Asian community, the South Asian community, Pacific Islander community, the Southeast Asian community. I think it would be helpful if we just started by saying who's who in this mix. And I'm going to sort of go group by group and say, let's start with Professor Masuoka. Can you tell us who are we talking about when we talk about the East Asian community, Professor?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. It's a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation. When we talk about East Asian Americans, this is really prototypically, I think, what the type of Asian American that you're thinking of. I think in the American mind. So these are folks who are arriving from China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and depending on your politics, Hong Kong. So this is a group that has probably the two major waves, for especially here in California. This was the largest wave of our early Asian immigrant community, and also is part of the large wave that we've seen more recently. And I know we'll have a chance to talk about that as we talk about the kind of changing immigration waves.
All right. And Professor Dhingra, if I were to ask you, South Asian or South Asian American, who are we talking about in terms of that community?
First, again, thank you for having us and for everyone who's joining us. I love visiting Northern California, so if I can't be there in person, being virtually, I guess, is the next best thing. So South Asians and South Asian Americans are predominantly Indian, that's the largest population, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, Nepalese. Those are the main groups would fall under South Asian.
And how about the Pacific Islander community, Professor Masuoka?
So these are those who are from the Pacific Islands. I think, of course, we think about Hawaii, but then here in the United States, we also have a relationship with the American territories. So we have Pacific Islanders from American Samoa, Guam, and Tongan are the next largest groups, in addition to, of course, the variety of the islands in Oceania.
And then how about the Southeast Asian community, if I were trying to sort through the various folks who describe themselves as Southeast Asian or Southeast Asian American? Professor Dhingra, back to you.
Right. That's a major population that's been growing over the past few decades. That includes Vietnamese Americans, Filipinx Americans, Laotians, Cambodians, Singapore, that spectrum of Asia would fall under Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian Americans.
And I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball here and say, sometimes people will talk about Central Asia or Western Asia. Let's start with Central Asia. What are people talking about when they talk about Central Asia, and are they part of what are commonly understood to be part of the Asian community and the Asian American community here in the United States? Central Asia, either one of the professors, please pop in.
Well, I think the first thing I'll say is that this is a real question for the field of Asian American Studies, which is really how do we draw the boundary of Asian America? In our department here at UCLA, we've thought about how to expand the definition, and we've recently had a faculty colleague with a specialization in Palestine join our department. So I think that this is something that is an important conversation. It's not necessarily something that has been clearly demarcated, I think, in terms of how far out, right, when we think about the Asian continent it goes. But usually when we think about Central Asia, we're thinking about the areas, for example, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, right? So the area, effectively between India and the Middle East.
And when you said the Middle East, is that the area that people are largely referring to if they use the phrase Western Asia?
I mean, it could be the case. I don't know. I don't hear Western Asia as often referring to the Middle East per se as probably like Western sections of Asia before you get to the Middle East. I mean, these are all somewhat confusing categories.
All right. Well, I think for purposes of our conversation tonight, we really are focused on the East Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander, and Southeast Asian communities. But I did just want to pause briefly to talk about the occasional reference that people will hear or see in print to Central Asia and Western Asia. And let me just say, this is a pretty broad term when we talk about the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. I think the Asian American Pacific Islander community is hardly a monolith. This is one of the issues that comes up fairly frequently in conversations that I'm a part of, at least. And so I think it's important that we drill down a bit. And while there are literally dozens of communities within the larger Asian American Pacific Islander community, there probably are, I want to say something like 7 subgroups who taken together make up 95% of the Asian American Pacific Islander population here in Santa Clara County. And let's just take a little time to learn a bit about their histories in the United States and the similarities and differences. The 4 largest are probably our Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipino, and Asian Indian populations. And I just would like to first, before I ask you to sort of tell us a little bit about the experiences of these communities and then on to the Japanese American, Korean American, and Pacific Islander communities, ask Michele Liu. Ms. Liu, you were at the head of a major social service and healthcare organization, AACI, here for more than a decade. Were all of these communities, the Chinese American community, the Vietnamese community, the Filipino community, the Asian Indian community, Japanese, Korean, and Pacific Islander communities, were they all part of your client base?
Thanks, Joe. And I want to add my appreciation for you hosting tonight's talk. As I was getting ready for this, Joe, I was thinking about how you and I both grew up in Palo Alto here in Santa Clara County. And as a kid in the 70s, there was one other Asian kid in my grade in Palo Alto. I think the population was less than 4% Asian back then in the 70s. And fast forward to 2020, we're probably at least 30% Asian in Palo Alto now. For Cupertino, 1970s, 3% Asian. And today, probably 63% and going up. So our community, Joe, is very different than it was when I was growing up, and probably even more when you were growing up. And I really have to give credit to the 12 founders of AACI, Asian Americans for Community Involvement, some of whom are on this Zoom tonight. Back in 1973, they were probably the first activists in Santa Clara County to embrace the term Asian American. Before that, groups identified by their ethnicity, Chinese, Japanese, etc. But the founders of AACI saw the power of coming together as a collective, and really over the decades grew to provide services to all Asian subgroups and as well as non-Asian folks. And my hat's off to Sarita Kohli, the current CEO, for continuing that legacy.
Well, thank you for that recollection. And I don't want us to get too bogged down in the numbers, but I think you have provided some very helpful context. And let me just put these 3 numbers out there for folks. 50 years ago, the population of Santa Clara County was probably, as you suggested, Michele Liu, 3-4% at most. Here we are 50 years later, and the Asian American population and Pacific Islander population in Santa Clara County is at or approaching 40%. So a dramatic difference, a significant change over the course of the last 5 decades. And of course, that means that our county is a very different place and has a very different mix of communities than the rest of the country, because on a national basis, we're talking about estimates of anywhere from 5 to 7% of the population being Asian American and Pacific Islander, as again contrasted with our 40% or pretty close here in Santa Clara County. So a very different dynamic. And part of the reason for the conversation tonight was to try and get a more refined sense of some of these stories. So, Dr. Masuoka, if I were to say to you, well, what's the difference between the different stories? Well, let's just take them one by one. So the Chinese American experience is born, here in Santa Clara County, the Chinese American community is probably over a quarter of our Asian American population. So, tell us a little bit about the Chinese American community and how they got here. Let's start there.
So I think, of course, it's I think a great place to start when we start thinking about Chinese America. This was really the first major wave of Asian immigration in the United States. I think it's a really interesting conversation between you and Michele, because I think, when we, I think to also just contextualize this, is that usually when we think about immigration now, we think about the date 1965. Because in 1965 is when we had our most recent, you could say, liberalization of immigration policy in the United States. So this was part of the civil rights movement, an effort to truly allow equity in the types of immigrants that come to the United States. Before 1965, we had some major immigration laws that really restricted immigrants to come to the United States. And so we think about, first, the group who came in, who really, established, I think, much of, unfortunately, the immigration policy in the United States in the early, the late 19th century, early 20th century, is that we welcomed the Chinese. They came, really famously into California to do things like help build the Transcontinental Railroad, service the various different industries related to the California Gold Rush, and we're a large population, particularly here in the Bay, here in California, but in the Bay Area, as well as throughout Central Valley and Southern California. Chinese America was really the largest before 1965. Now today, interestingly, even with the dramatic diversity of immigration, the Chinese still continue to be the largest group, Asian national origin group entering the United States. But it's a really fundamentally different type of community than we saw before 1965. Before 1965, this is a group that were primarily servicing various different labor industries, like we were talking about railroads, laundry, agriculture, food industries. Whereas today we have Chinese Americans coming in from and entering quite a broad number of fields, and one of which here is, of course, technology. They service various different kinds of engineering and STEM fields due to some of the different changes that we've given in terms of prioritizing work in occupational sectors in the United States. So we've really seen quite a dramatic, I think a long history, but I think an important change here in terms of the types of Chinese Americans that were here before 1965, right? I think some of the population here that you guys talked about here when you're in your early days, versus the Chinese American population and the Chinese American population that we see today as of 2021.
Thank you for that background. I was smiling because it struck me that I recently talked with a colleague here in Santa Clara County who is Chinese American, referenced the fact that he's a fourth generation Californian, fourth generation American, and I had to chuckle because I'm third generation. My grandparents were foreign born, and as we have this challenging time we're working through yet again here around race and ethnicity in the United States, I was struck by the fact that my own family roots are relatively recent compared or contrasted with folks who are sometimes obliged to assert or prove their Americanness or their connection to the state or the nation. So with that background on the Chinese American experience, brief though it is given our time, we'll get back to some other issues there. Professor Dhingra, what about the Vietnamese community here in the United States and in California? You may know, I'm not sure that all of our participants will know, here in San Jose, which is the county seat for Santa Clara County, we have what I am told is the largest Vietnamese population of any city outside Vietnam. So probably 20+% of the Asian American population and Pacific Islander population here in Santa Clara County, Vietnamese. What's the story there in terms of that community's presence in our state and our nation?
It's great to highlight the Vietnamese American story for multiple reasons, but one is because it really disrupts kind of our standard narrative around Asian Americans and Asian immigration. So if we talk about, in the immigration of Asian Americans, the Vietnamese, but like you hear my dog snoring in the background, it's because he's always snoring, not because this is boring by any means. It's because Vietnamese mostly, for the most part, arrived as refugees, which is contrast our normal understanding of people who voluntarily move from one country to another in search of, whatever it is, better jobs, better opportunities, better conditions, right? So it's important to understand that the old adage, we are here because you were there, definitely fits, right, for the Vietnamese American experience. And dating back to 1975, when the first wave of Vietnamese were fleeing South Vietnam and came to the US. And a few years later, were followed by the so-called boat people, which I'm sure many of your people in the audience, have heard the term and have some, mental affiliation with that. Those were in the late 70s, fleeing Vietnam. And then there was even other refugees, Vietnamese refugees, who did not come straight from Vietnam to the US, but were in refugee camps across in the region. And then they gradually came to the US under the Orderly Departure Program. And the Vietnamese community has really grown, right, over the decades, from a relatively small part of Asian America to a very substantive component. And they were assisted to some degree by programs by the government in terms of English training and employment programs, which can be common for refugees. So Cuban refugees, for instance, received a lot of support from the government as a way to settle into the US. And something to keep in mind when you're thinking about why one population does well compared to another, the support they may get when they come here plays a big role. And then today, Vietnamese are very pronounced in small business, whether it be nail salons, food stores, restaurants, import, export shops, and the like. And it's a very heterogeneous population even amongst themselves, right? We talk about educational achievement, financial, political opinions, and the like. It's a growing, as you already said, and with that comes, a lot of differences within. But that kind of gives you a sense of the background.
What about the Filipino community, Professor Masuoka? We have probably, double digits, I think 14-15% of the Asian American and Pacific Islander population here in Santa Clara County is Filipino. What's the backstory there in terms of the Filipino American community and their presence here and their history?
So the one of the nice things here about comparing Chinese Americans, Vietnamese, and Filipino is that now we're seeing really the different ways in which these different immigrant groups have an attachment to the United States. So the Philippines is unique in the long-standing history of the United States presence and occupation in the Philippines. So at one point the Philippines was an American territory, and so there's been this long-standing interactions, influence of the United States government that really in many ways was part of the encouraging the migration of Filipinos into the United States. Early Filipino immigrants came primarily to service the agricultural industry, particularly in here in California. When we were talking in this group about, kind of which groups we were going to choose, I chose Filipino Americans because I'm a native, born and raised from Stockton, California. And for those of you who know anything about the Central Valley, this was the population that I grew up with, Filipinos Americans, because Filipinos, they were really one of the dominant agricultural groups working in the agricultural industry, doing really, the essential work that was built California to be the agricultural behemoth that it ended up being. And so I think when we see, our first wave of Filipino immigrants really having a long-standing connection to areas like the Central Valley. And today, we see really, Filipinos becoming although they were kind of relatively on the smaller side, today being now the third largest group in the national origin group in the United States. And it's a very different population than compared to the population that first arrived here in California. So today, we see Filipinos come for fulfilling various different services, primarily things like nursing, because of the nursing shortage and the connections, the longstanding connections of the Philippines with the United States, with medical industry. And so we see a much more diverse Filipino community, and one that really isn't necessarily essential to the Central Valley, right? So now we see larger populations of Filipinos in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, in the New York tri-state area, with their shift in the different types of occupations that they service today.
Got it. Thank you. And Professor Dhingra, can you tell us a little bit about the Asian Indian community here in the United States and its sort of story and path to the United States as well, if you could, please?
The largest portion of Asian Indians or South Asians who came, historically, were in the Pacific Northwest, the Washington area, Oregon, Canada. We were often working in lumber mills. From the early 1900s till the early 1920s. And they were met with a lot of resistance. In 1907, in Bellingham, Washington, there was a major mob attack on Sikhs. They were mostly Sikh men, although they're referred to as Hindus, which Hindoos. They were actually Sikhs. And they were, attacked. They had to flee for their own safety. And it was a dramatic but yet telling sign of how Sikhs as well as other Asians experienced a lot of resentment for quote unquote taking jobs, a narrative that's obviously been growing and continuing with us with immigration since. And speaking of Stockton, right, the first Sikh Gurdwara was started in 1911 or 1912. And so it has a long history, but like a lot of Asian immigration,
excuse the interruption, but you may need to tell folks what a Gurdwara is.
Okay, sorry. It's a Sikh temple. It's a temple for the Sikh faith. Thank you for that clarification. So a lot of Asian immigration got cut off in 1924, including of South Asians. But then it slowly began again in 1952 with the Immigration Act then. And I'll highlight that because it's a less well-known immigration act, but it had a very meaningful impact on Asian Indians and on America at large. So in case you and the people who are with us today don't know, Asian Indians own about 50% of the nation's motels. Your Days Inns, your Hampton Inns, all of these motels we take for granted. And I know this because I wrote a book about this called Life Behind the Lobby. And they got their start in the industry in the 1940s and 50s, in part because of that 1952 act. But as Natalie already alluded to, 1965 was a major immigration change that led to a whole flood of Asian Indians and other Asian Americans to migrate. And Asian Indians today kind of, some ways are fit this model minority profile, right? You do find a lot of them are highly educated. They come with high educations. They come as families, so they're easier to settle down and build community here. You see them in all kinds of industries that we've already alluded to, but also in some kind of pop culture references. So the spelling bee. And so if you don't already know, Asian Indian kids dominate the Scripps National Spelling Bee. Something else I wrote about. So it's very diverse, fast growing, one of the fastest growing immigrant populations of any kind in the country. And the last thing I'll say is that many Asian Indians have arrived since 1990 under the H-1B visa program, which I'm sure many people here are listening are familiar with. It's been a great asset to technology companies and the like.
Right, thank you for that. And let me just ask before I go to Michele Liu, because I am sort of increasingly struck by the diverse experiences that are being described here between and among various parts of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. But Professor Dhingra, you mentioned, you used the term Asian Indian, you used the term South Asian. I've sometimes heard folks talk about the Indo-American community. First of all, let me just ask, is there a preferred term within the communities? And are there terms that, within the boundaries of good taste, you can tell us, stay away from?
I appreciate that. So, and I didn't even realize I was interchanging terms. That's how often I do it. So if you want to refer specifically to Indians, you can say Indian American or Asian Indian American, because Indian American could get confused with Native American. So depending on the context, if it's not obvious, then you would say Asian Indian American. If the context is relatively clear, you could just say Indian American. And then South Asian American refers to what we call the subcontinent, right? The whole set of people who come to the US from, as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, et cetera, and India. So if you want to be a bit more expansive, right, and inclusive, you would use South Asian American. As we all know, right, the bigger your categories get, the more heterogeneous the people are, and it's harder to give like clear singular narratives around them or descriptions around them. But nonetheless, South Asian American is a fine term to use if you're not trying to specify which exact nation you're referring to. In terms of terms to avoid, just the ones that are so obvious, I won't bother to.
Thank you for that. All right, then let me just turn again to Michele Liu, who, as I mentioned, was for more than a decade the CEO at AACI, Asian Americans for Community Involvement, and now is at the Health Trust here in Santa Clara County. Ms. Liu, you've been serving these communities for a long time now, and even in your work in government, in our office at the State Senate, State Assembly, the phone calls would come, the emails would flood in for folks who needed help. Were there differences that in the sort of the needs and requirements of the different communities, even as you were looking back over the last 5, 10, 15, now 20 years? Because, as I say, the term Asian American, which I want to ask the professors about in a minute in terms of what it means and its derivation, but people use this umbrella term pretty casually to describe a lot of very distinct communities. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, Joe, I was reminiscing about the days when I worked for you and helped you with scheduling. And I'm Chinese American, but I learned a lot on the job as well. I remember getting calendar invites for Double 10th Day, which is an important celebration for the Taiwanese community, and realizing that is a totally different event and significant holiday than October 1st, which is a momentous day for the People's Republic of China. And we had similar experiences in the Vietnamese community around which flags are symbolic of what. And it's something for all of us to learn, especially here in Santa Clara County, where we do have so many Asian subgroups. One of the things that AACI has championed and still has to champion today is making sure we disaggregate Asian data, because if we lump everybody into one group, sometimes we miss health disparities or other differences between the groups that really need a tailored approach. So for example, some Asian subgroups have much higher rates of liver cancer than other ones do. And so we need to make sure that we're disaggregating the data and then tailoring our approaches and our messagings for the specific groups.
Thank you. I should just tell the professors that Ms. Liu is lobbying me a little bit here in real time, because here at the county, we take this health work very seriously. And in fact, a few years ago, at the suggestion of folks at AACI, I pushed for an Asian disparity health study so that we could do a more, there it is, so that we could do a more finely grained assessment and develop a more fine-tuned understanding of the different health needs from community to community. And in fact, as Michele reminds us that the differences are very real. So working in that environment and acknowledge, or those environments, and acknowledging the sort of differences between and among various subsets of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, let me ask either Professor Dhingra or Professor Masuoka, where did this term Asian American come from and what does it mean? We're going to talk a little bit more about identity issues in our third panel on the 27th of May, but I think as we have the conversation tonight, before we get to some more levels of understanding about who's part of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, probably helpful to say, where did that term come from and what does it mean?
Yeah, that's a great question because it is a historically invented term. And it dates primarily back to the 1960s and the Asian American movement that was inspired by civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in particular. And it was a way to move away from the term of the day, which was Oriental, which has, not only, which it kind of just has within it an inherent foreignness, right? And a lack of human quality, frankly. And so your rugs may be Oriental, but people aren't, was the phrase was what people would say. So that kind of just to kind of cut it short, it had a birth time at that moment with that in mind, and as a way of claiming an Americanness, and the last thing I'll say is, one of the primary themes you see in Asian American history and contemporary experiences is being assumed to be Asian, that is a foreigner and not American. And so saying Asian American became a political act, right? So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Let me just ask Michele, if you don't mind my asking a slightly personal question. You talked about growing up in Santa Clara County with only a handful of Asian classmates, and did people understand you to be Chinese American, or did they lump you in some larger undefined category of Asian American people?
As a kid growing up here in the 70s in Palo Alto, I think people knew Chinese and Japanese, and that was it. And in fact, if you go back and look at the 1970 census, I think the only Asian subgroups they captured were Chinese and Japanese. Today, of course, we track many more subgroups, and that's important, again, for the disaggregation of data. But I think back then, people just thought we were all Chinese.
And today, in your sort of just experience out in the community, do you think people understand that there are these different subgroups and that they've had very different experiences? I mean, we're going to talk in a minute about the Japanese American and Korean American and Pacific Islander communities, but and certainly in the groups you work with, people understand these differences, but as part of the larger community, do you think people sort of get that there's this level of complexity and that we could, if we had the time, be talking about scores of different Asian American and Pacific Islander communities?
Joe, I think there's a range of people's experience and perspective on Asian Americans in Santa Clara County. You and I travel throughout the county on a regular basis, and we know that San Jose has the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam. But for many North County residents who don't have reason to come to San Jose, they might find the Vietnamese community is less visible. Similarly, other folks may interact primarily with the Indian community and not have as much familiarity with the burgeoning, robust Korean community in Santa Clara.
So let me ask the professors before we go on to talking about the Japanese community, Japanese American community, and the Korean American community, and the Pacific Islander community. What's your experience in other parts of the country or other parts of the state in Professor Masuoka's circumstance? Do people sort of lump all of these very distinct and diverse communities together, or do they have an appreciation and understanding for just how diverse and complex the mix is?
Well, I think, what I want to say is that, having panels like this, I think greater openness to things today. I think really over the last maybe 10 years or so, there's just been a general amongst people who are not Asian American, I think a general recognition of the diversity in the population. I think food has a lot to do with it, that people know that they can go get sushi or Chinese, right, or Thai, and not to say that necessarily we want to boil things down to what we all eat, but I think that it has made a difference in understanding the true variation of Asian America here in the United States.
Natalie, I'm so glad you mentioned food. How did we go this long on an Asian people talk without talking about the food? Shame on us.
I can't be from LA and not mention the food. I had a colleague the other day that dropped the word boba in his talk, and I think the entire young audience that was below the age of 21 completely knew what boba was, but then all of the older adults in the room was like, "What was that?" So for those of you who don't necessarily know what boba is, it's this tea drink. I think the Taiwanese have credited themselves with the origins of it, but it's a kind of an iced tea drink that's got milk in it, and there are these chewy tapioca pieces in it. It's like a new Starbucks for our most youngest generation, and so even if they're not Asian, they love to go and stop at the boba shop, particularly here in LA. It's incredibly sweet. I cannot drink it myself, and it's definitely a taste. So yes, no, I mean, I think an Angelino here and me definitely needs to talk about the food.
Well, I have to interject here two things, Professor Masuoka. First is here at the county, our public health department would tell you they're concerned about the excessive sugar content and as a public health matter. And Ms. Liu will perhaps be surprised that I am actually mindful of the recent reports of a tapioca shortage and the potential impact on the boba purveyors here in Santa Clara County. So it's duly noted. Professor Dhingra, can we get you to take us to another part of this conversation in terms of your experience? You're in the East Coast, of course. I know 4 of the 5 largest Asian American Pacific Islander communities in the country are here on the West Coast, in LA and San Diego and San Jose and San Francisco. New York, of course, number 1, simply by virtue of the size, but also by virtue of the diversity. But when you talk to folks who are not in your classes, but who are just part of the general community, do they think in this more sort of finely textured way, or do they have a sort of a broader notion that, yes, there are some folks who are Asian American, but that's about as far as it goes? What's your experience? I'm
happy to elaborate on that, but first I want to share that the Starbucks in Amherst closed down and a boba tea place took over the site, which for my kids is a win-win. Anyway, so but yeah, to your question, the knowledge of Asian Americans, I have to say, I think still remains relatively limited. I mean, I spent 8+ years of my adulthood in Ohio, which is actually wonderful. I'm a big fan of the area, but the knowledge of Asian Americans is relatively limited. Even in the East Coast or the New England area, Northeast, where in areas with highly educated persons who intermix with a lot of other Asian Americans, also may have a very limited understanding. And I think it happens in a couple of ways. One is the presumption that certain people are Asian Americans and other Asian Americans are just not, right? So we ask around, South Asians are less likely to be understood or seen as Asian American, even though, obviously they are, but they're just not understood as such. So that's one kind of gap. Another gap plays out less in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of, let's say, class differences or occupational differences or that kind of thing. So the shootings in Atlanta, for instance, of the massage workers really opens up a conversation around the variety of jobs and work experiences Asian Americans have that fall outside of a model minority profile. And that often is obscure to most Americans, unless you happen to know a particular kind of occupation. The general image is so different that that's another kind of knowledge gap to put in place.
So, and I just want to make sure I'm tracking this. So you're saying that while people may, if they give it a thought, intellectually understand that there are different communities within the larger Asian American community, that their conception is of an Asian American community or group that's sort of amorphously all rolled together. Did I get that right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So we may be attentive to ethnic differences within Asian America increasingly. I think that's true. And the takeout menu, like way of thinking about that makes sense. But even if we appreciate the ethnic variation, I think we have a hard time recognizing the class variation or the geographic variation or other kind of divisions within, which are very pronounced, but we overlook those.
All right. Well, to that point, Professor Masuoka, let me go back to you and ask. We have yet to talk about the Japanese American experience or the Korean American experience or the Pacific Islander experience. And here in Santa Clara County, I was actually surprised that the Japanese American community is just 4% of the Asian American community here in Santa Clara County, perhaps because it has a very long history here in Santa Clara County and is a very well-established community, and because, frankly, there's a big part of the story that's really quite tragic and much told, and so why don't I ask you to take it from there and tell us a little bit about the Japanese American experience, and as I said, we eventually I want to try and do a little more compare and contrast.
So I think that introduction is very pertinent because I think this has been my own experience. So I think depending on what generation Californian you are, when you think about Asian America, if you are an older, you've been here from California for a long time, you think about the Asian American population in California as really being Chinese and Japanese. So the Japanese community was very large in California up through about, I would usually say, World War II. And so this was the group that probably if you were going to have a contact with, you were either going to have contact with a Japanese American or a Chinese American. They were the second wave following Chinese into California, had a very, had sizable presence in all areas in California because they both did agriculture, but also settled in the various different cities. Japanese immigration into the United States really did plummet after World War II. And so I think, we know this history and the internment of Japanese Americans and I think the tension between the United States and Japan, that Japanese immigration really did very seriously decline. And so now, if you are a younger Californian, I think you are really less likely, right, to think of your Asian American neighbor as someone who is of Japanese American descent. So our generations here in California, I think, have very different understandings and perceptions, right, about who their neighbors were, depending on really that time, kind of the time of their kind of adulthood that they had in California. And so today, Japanese, not even just in California, but in the United States broadly, represent a shrinking share of the Asian population.
A significant percentage of the Japanese American population are intermarried. Not suggesting more than half, but compared to even other Asian groups, because there's been less immigration coming in, those growing up here increasingly are intermarried with other Asian Americans, with whites, with others. So it's a shrinking population in terms of numbers, but it's varying in terms of its ethnic composition of the families.
Right. So the Japanese Americans, I think, are more like European ethnics, right, where they have their immigration history was really 4 or 5, 6 generations ago. You have a much smaller share of the Japanese American population that's really connected with the immigration experience. But because they're 4th, 5th, possibly sixth generation here in the United States, right? They don't necessarily, they live in very integrated neighborhoods. My own family is very multiracial. So I have family members who are white, Mexican American, right? Various different, European origins, and that's a really common experience for Japanese Americans today, primarily because, right, we are multiple generations here in the United States.
Well, I want to make sure that we have time to talk about the Korean American community and the Pacific Islander community. But since we're on this topic of multiracial households, and we will be talking on at our third panel in particular about issues of identity. But I do want to sort of stop and say, so we've talked about the various subgroups. Where does the multiracial community fit in, Professor Masuoka? I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to go to Ms. Liu because I've got a question about her own experience I'd like her to share her thoughts on if she's willing. Professor?
So we have a growing mixed race, we've also called multiracial population, particularly here in California and in particular in the Bay Area. With our youngest generation, there are people who really identify with two or more races. And for Asian America, because of the relatively high intermarriage rates, mixed race or biracial Asian Americans make up a growing share of our community. And so this is something that I think is an important intervention into the study of Asian America. And it's also, I think, an important way of thinking about, right, how these different communities, the makeup of these communities really are changing, right, I think, from what we really think of, kind of in our more prototypical understanding of Asian America.
And when people have these conversations, is the term mixed race, multiracial, biracial? What is there a preferred vernacular? Are any of those terms usable if they are appropriate to the circumstance?
So since the multiracial population in the United States is so young, the terms that are being used, I think, are really in flux. It's the same way that we see any term being constructed when we talked about Asian American, but you probably heard about various different terms, for example, like Latinx, right? So all of these various different terms come about with new generations embracing their own term. Because the mixed race population is so young, I don't think we really know exactly what terms they prefer. What we do know is that there is really quite a variety of terms. And I think in Asian America, we actually add more. For example, the word hapa, which originates from Hawaii, hapa haole, which effectively means mixed and foreigner, or mixed and white, is something that has carried over because a lot of the Asian American population, especially here in California, immigrated through Hawaii, right? And so brought that term hapa. And so on college campuses, you might actually see, like, for example, a student organization that is a biracial Asian organization, that they really embrace the term hapa, right, as part of their organization's name.
And Michele Liu, I know you have a mixed race youngster. What, how does, again, we're going to talk, I keep coming back to these identity issues that we're going to explore more fully in a couple of weeks. But, I think you would describe yourself as American-born Chinese, and a phrase that you and I have talked about a little bit, and its acronym, ABC, which I tried to persuade you stood for Armenian by choice, but you were not buying that when I made the case. So there you go. But on a more serious note, so how does a biracial or mixed race child identify in these various categories in your own experience and friends, neighbors, and clients that you've served over the years?
Well, first, I'm very proud that I taught you what ABC really means, American-born Chinese, which is what I am. And if you asked me what race my son is, I would tell you Asian. His dad, who is of European descent, might give you a different answer. But it's funny you bring it up because today we were able to get our 13-year-old vaccinated, and I was filling out the online form and got to the race checkbox. And at first, I wasn't sure how to fill it out because he is multiracial. And I was going to just pick the Asian box until I realized you could actually check more than one box, which I did. But I'm really excited for the next generation. As Natalie mentioned, the multiracial population is relatively young and growing. We tease our son that eventually all Californians are going to be brown-haired and brown-eyed just like he is. But we really want to make sure that we are exposing him to all aspects of his heritage. And then we will support him, whatever terms he chooses to use for his identity.
Let's go to Professor Dhingra, and thank you, Ms. Liu. It's helpful, I think, to be able to sort of put a personal framework around these sort of abstract and academic issues sometimes. Professor Dhingra, how about our Korean American population? Again, here in Santa Clara County, a relatively modest percentage of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, just 5% perhaps, but what's the story there? Again, a very different story than some of these other communities we've been talking about in terms of their role and presence and history. What would you share with us?
Korean immigration kind of has three major waves to it. So the first wave would be the early 1900s to about 1950. And the first Koreans arrived to Hawaii and worked on the plantations there. And it kind of fits a very good narrative within Asian American history that, Chinese came and they got excluded. Japanese came to take their place, and then the Gentleman's Act kind of limited their immigration. And Koreans came. And so you kind of see one kind of taking the place. But it's simplistic, but there's a truth to that. And they were working on the plantations in Hawaii. Very tough labor, very tough work, a lot of exploitation of migrants at that time. And like a lot of Asians, immigration got cut off in 1924. But some left Hawaii that came to California, but again, overall, immigration got cut off. The Korean American story differs from others in some ways because of the Korean War. And so around 1950 to 1964, you see kind of a second wave of migration tied to the war. It could be brides of veterans, of children, right, and others who arrive around the wartime. And then finally, post 65 is this, again, the kind of, it's hard to say current because it's 50 years ago, but it at least allowed for the current wave that we see now. A lot came as highly educated professionals, but what's somewhat unique about this, unlike, let's say, Japanese immigrants who've come since 65 as highly educated, or South Asian immigrants who've come since, or Chinese immigrants, many Koreans who are highly educated ended up in small businesses that were or in manual labor jobs, very removed from their occupational skills and training. So it was not uncommon to see someone who had been an engineer now be a janitor. And Korean American small businesses Korean Americans have probably the highest rates of small business ownership among Asian Americans, above the national average. And there's a lot of stories around this, a lot of popular culture references to this. But it's been a strong piece of the Korean American experience. And Koreatowns exist in different parts of the country, not as robust as Chinatowns, for instance. But in Koreatowns, they're mostly commercial areas with very few Koreans living there. In LA, for instance, I think the largest residential population in Koreatown are Latinx immigrants, even though Korean businesses are known to populate there. So, but anyway, that gets to the small business part of the Korean experience. And one last thing that's a bit distinctive about the Korean American experience is the religiosity. And highly, on average, they're Protestant, some Catholics, but beyond just that, highly committed to their religion. And so the joke is that, whenever there's more than 3 Koreans in an area, they start a church. And so, don't take that too literally, but the point is that the church has become a major central community space. And even those who are born and raised in the US fluent in English will often still prefer to be in a Korean church with other Korean Americans rather than in a mainstream church. Even though the services and the language, even the music may seem identical, the Korean church still remains a central spiritual and communal hub.
All right, and finally, Professor Masuoka, we're in May. It is both nationally and here at the county, Asian American and Pacific Islander Memorial Month, and we are Heritage Month, rather, excuse me, and we include the Pacific Islander community, although it is, by most estimates, a relatively small number of folks here in Santa Clara County. The numbers I see hover around 1%. I know there is concern, Michele Liu, in the Pacific Islander community that they are undercounted and underrepresented in a lot of the work with the Pacific Islander community. But and there's even some debate about whether or not the phrases Asian American and Pacific Islander should be in the same sentence or phrase. But what's your take? What should we know about the Pacific Islander community and its experience here in the United States? I know that's a big question, but if you can help just parse it a little bit, that would be appreciated.
I think it's really important for us to recognize separately and give their own time the Pacific Island community. I mean, I think, unfortunately, this is, just kind of saying Pacific Islander, it's just like talking about the Asian American community, right? That it's a very diverse group of peoples from a wide variety of islands in Oceania. And so I think in some ways, fitting them in this way is somewhat of a disservice. And in that way, this is one of the challenges with Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, which is that oftentimes, we do highlight the Asian American experience, right? But we don't necessarily give its fair share to Pacific Islanders. One of the things, I do not necessarily want to declare myself as any kind of expert on the Pacific Island experience, but as chair of an Asian American Studies department, one of the things that been learning is really, the placement of Pacific Islands in the study of kind of Asian American studies. And I think one of the things that we're talking about is to what extent Pacific Islander experience really maps on better to the indigenous or the Native American Indian population in a better way, right, than the Asian American experience, which really is, I think, especially if we've talked in this conversation, it is really the quintessential immigrant experience, right? So when we think about Asian America. But for Pacific Islanders, these are populations that have a relationship with the United States in which their land, was occupied by the United States or by another European country. The four major, the three largest groups, Native Hawaiians, Samoans, and Guam or Chamorro, they also would be another word to describe a Guamanian, are the largest, right, because they have a territorial relationship with the United States, right? So we have integrated Hawaii as the 50th state. American Samoa, Guam, and the Mariana Islands are all American territories. It is a fraught relationship, that oftentimes has really disadvantaged and in many ways kind of severely impacted in negative ways these Pacific Islander communities on the islands, but also here when they reach the continental United States, in which we see some of the detrimental effects of occupation, where there's more likely to have, we're more likely to see things like major health challenges, lower, for example, high school education rates, right? So these long-standing challenges related to the underrepresentation of island communities, and peoples in their governance, right, in the services that they're provided for them. And so we are seeing, I think, especially when we start studying more so increasingly, because I think that Michelle's right that, there's more and more attention to the underrepresentation of Pacific Islanders in the United States, that we are recognizing, right, our responsibility to Pacific Islander communities in rectifying, right, some of the challenges that have happened, really due to American occupation.
While the Santa Clara County Pacific Islander population is small, in East Palo Alto, which is literally just over the highway from us Palo Altans, there is a sizable Pacific Islander population. And just like Natalie mentioned, they deserve their own attention and resources that I fear they don't get because they're, again, lumped into AAPI.
Duly noted. And let me just say that we have talked about the Chinese American, Vietnamese American, Filipino, Asian, Indian, Japanese American, Korean American, and Pacific Islander communities that taken together probably comprise 95% of the Asian American population here and Pacific Islander population, here in Santa Clara County. And yet there are literally dozens of other communities within the rubric of Asian American and Pacific Islander that we have not even had occasion to mention. The Hmong community is an example. I mentioned that, Professor Masuoka, because if you're from the Central Valley, I know you're familiar with the Hmong community on a firsthand basis. Is just one of literally dozens of folks. So time does not permit, but I wanted to acknowledge that. I want to go now to the questions with the time we have remaining. And we have a number of questions about topics you have already touched on briefly, but I think people would like to elaborate. The question is, can you talk about the laws, actually 3 questions on immigration. Can you talk about the laws restricting immigration from Asia? How has U.S. immigration policy affected the mix of subpopulations over time? And how would you describe the current immigration situation with respect to API subgroups coming to America? So, Professor Dhingra, would you like to start? And then I'll go to Professor Masuoka.
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. So I don't know if I can answer all of it succinctly, but let's date back to 1882, right? Well, actually, date back to 1875, when the U.S. government, in effect, barred the immigration of Chinese women under the rubric that they would be their moral threats as prostitutes, right? And so 1882, Chinese immigration is stopped. There's some other laws here and there, but 1924, practically all Asian immigration is barred, and Asians could not become citizens, which in California meant you could not own land. So it was a way not only to deny more Asians from coming, but to dispossess those who were here. As I mentioned before, 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, I believe it's called, allowed a small opening for Indians and Filipinos, but and that had some meaningful long-term impacts, but at the time, not much of a impact. And then 1965, the Immigration Naturalization Act, then really, opened the gates got rid of the racist quotas that were denying or privileging certain regions for immigration over others. And the one thing to say about the 1965 Act is that it passed despite its effects. That is to say, people were assured back then that don't worry, we're opening up this immigration law, we're opening up our borders, but don't worry, the people who come to this country will still be of European ancestry. It was not expected that it would lead to increased migration from Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world that had been in effect stopped. And one other thing it did also is impact Latinx immigration. And basically helped create a large amount of undocumented immigration, which I can get into, I guess, is a different topic.
Let me ask Professor Masuoka what she would add to or elaborate on from that baseline of information about immigration, and particularly sort of the state of the situation today in terms of Asian American growth in the future based on immigration patterns that are more recently set in place.
So Pawan did a great job with that summary in a very speedy amount of time. I teach classes that go semesters long, try to go over this immigration. I think I would love to add more detail, but this is not my class, so we will not do that. I think one of the important things to mention, and I think we have covered this, but I want to emphasize this because this is really just really contextualizing how we've seen such a distinctive change in the makeup of the Asian population in the United States, which is that in 1965, part of it was about removing these national origin quotas, right, that limited specifically people from Asia and then some Southern and Eastern European nations from the United States. But as a way of effectively liberalizing the policy, it switched then to these very other dimensions, right, that determine your visa. One of which now as of today's immigration policy, we really prioritize kind of three ways, which is one, family reunification. So if you had a family member already here in the United States, you can then sponsor your family over. And so I think that is in many ways describing some of the Asian population, which is that they've had long-standing communities here and they can bring their families to the United States, or kind of extended family. The second one, which I think Pawan actually noted, the H-1B visa, which is that then we also prioritize people who can offer particular occupations or service industries that we have a real need for. And one of a big share of that industry really were these science, engineering, technology, and medical fields. And so this H-1B, visa process, right, this work visa, really prioritizes people who have at minimum a high school degree. And really, because of the competitiveness, really, we're talking about immigrants are coming in with very high levels of education, college educations, right, post-baccalaureate degrees, who enter because they are recruited, right, to join these very professional occupations in STEM industries. And then we had refugee, or an integration of a refugee policy with the changing of immigration law after 1965. And then everyone else, right, who doesn't really meet really these three basic features, really doesn't necessarily have a good chance of gaining legal documentation in the United States, right? And so when we see immigrants from Asia come with a visa, they really do make up a very particular type of Asian immigrant, because you have to meet very specific requirements, right, in order to obtain a visa. And for that reason, that's why today's Asian population really tends to be much more educated, right, much more, they're coming from families with a lot higher levels of education. And for that reason, right, we see Asian settlement enter very different areas in California than what we've seen in the past, right? So I was talking about Central Valley, right? So these, and also, a lot of the Chinatowns. But now we see, because they are higher income, they have higher income jobs in the United States, they're more likely, right, to enter these wealthier suburban neighborhoods, and are really diversifying, I think, a part of California that we really didn't see historically.
So, and I guess it's a comment, and also I actually have a question for I guess Michele and you Joe. There's there's a growing amount of undocumented immigration among Asian Americans, and it happens in two ways. One is crossing a border without full documentation, but also another way it happens is through overstaying a visa. So you have a work visa or a tourist visa, and then you overstay, and then you're undocumented. You become undocumented immigrant. So that's my comment. And it's quickly growing. It's a fast growing portion of Asian America and a fast growing portion of undocumented immigration. And I know that's happening at the national level. I'd be curious to know how that's relevant in Santa Clara.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Pawan, because it is a real fact here in Santa Clara County. People are always surprised to realize how many Asians are undocumented immigrants, just for the reasons you mentioned. People come for education and then maybe they overstay their visa, or they come on a work visa, change jobs, but want to stay. And so just like undocumented immigrants from all different countries, many of our Asian undocumented immigrants are big contributors to the Silicon Valley economy and to our community.
And Professor Dhingra, I will just tell you, as someone who spent 12 years in the California state legislature trying to respond to what I'll call facts on the ground, the real life experience of people in the state of California and in my district, and now as a county supervisor, at the risk of stating what will be obvious to you, we've got a broken immigration system, and it has been rather clearly broken and dysfunctional, in my view, for at least 20 years. And so I think what you would hear, almost regardless of politics or ideology, is a frustration on the part of many folks that the system is so clearly broken and so clearly dysfunctional, and yet we just can't seem to get a federal response that is comprehensive by any measure. And at that, I'm going to say folks are listening in to hear from you all, not hear me editorialize on our broken system. But since you raised the question and put it on Ms. Liu and me, that's my reaction. It's just a broken system. It's been broken for a very long time. And I think most people have come to that conclusion almost apart from their politics, as I say. One question that I just think is a great one and relatively quick and easy, I hope, which is for folks who would like to know more about the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience, is there a book you would recommend? And please, not your own textbooks. But seriously, is there a book you would recommend to folks who are interested in reading and learning a bit more?
One book I recommend is called Asian American Dreams by Helen Zia, who lives in the Bay Area, author and activist, Asian American. It's a bit dated, but it is such an amazing treatment, engaging with historicizing. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Michele, Liu, how about you?
Well, I'm pretty sure that professors read a lot more books than I do. I wanted to encourage your viewers to check out PBS. They have a number of documentaries about the Asian American experience and history. They're free to stream during this May Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Totally worth checking out.
I have seen that 5-part series that I think that you are referencing and agree. It does a very nice job of covering a lot of material in a relatively short period of time, which is the struggle we're confronting tonight. Professor Masuoka, your thoughts? Is there a book you would recommend?
I think the other book that I would recommend is by the esteemed historian, UC Berkeley professor Ronald Takaki, and it's titled Strangers from a Different Shore. I had the privilege of meeting Professor Takaki before he passed away, and he is really memorable, but he is really attributed to being the first author on Asian American history. And he told me as a young student that really what he saw his role is telling stories, right, of people whose stories were never told. And it's a really great book because it's actually really not academic. It is really quite an interesting read because his goal was actually not to make it look like an academic textbook, because the whole point of Asian American stories being missing is because Asian Americans weren't really allowed to tell their stories from their own words. So it has a lot of poetry, right? Various different types of ways in which Asian Americans have told their different stories. And in the ways that you have set up our conversation today, it's broken up into the various different major national origin groups. So you can get a good sense of each story.
The title one more time, please, before we go to the next question.
Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki.
Thank you very much. Thank you all three. Another question goes to the reference that has been made by a couple of you about generational differences. Just any thoughts about generational differences, either in the experience or perspective of being Asian American, whether that's Chinese American or Japanese American or Pacific Islander, generational differences of which we should take note?
So, I think the first thing we'll do is we'll do a little bit of, translation of academic speak for our audience. So typically, particularly for academics, we use first, second, and third. First is actually the immigrant generation. So it's the generation that arrived here from the United States, but were born in a different country. Second are the children of immigrants. And then third are the grandchildren of immigrants. So that's usually when you hear an academic, that is actually what they mean. I've actually realized kind of engaging with the community, engaging with my students that I think some of the communities, the numbers do change a little bit. So when academics use those numbers, that's what we're referring to. And so I think, we can, of course, know and expect that there's very distinctive differences, right, between the first and the second. Because a large share of Asian America today entered after 1965, most of Asian Americans today are really quite familiar with either the first generation immigrant experience or the second generation experience. So either you're what it's like to be a migrant or what it's like to be a child of immigrants. And so I think when you talk probability wise, those are the two primary experiences that you would be having a chit chat with an Asian American today.
Professor
One of the things we see a lot in Santa Clara County is what Natalie just described. The second generation often has to serve as cultural brokers for their parents who may not speak English, who may be unfamiliar with the customs of American culture. Sometimes it's fun and sometimes it's a positive experience, but other times it can be very challenging and even traumatic. Say, for example, you have to translate for your parents' medical appointment and the doctor has bad news. One of the things that I love about your co-sponsor, Joe, Asian Americans for Community Involvement, is they provide a lot of mental health counseling and support services for intergenerational conflict and trauma.
And Professor Dhingra, I'm going to come to you in a minute as the first to answer what I'm afraid is our final question, and it's a great question. And I apologize to our viewers. We just do not have time for all the questions we've got. We'll try and work some of them into the second and third panels on the 20th and 27th. And again, I hope you all can join us. But the last question on which to close is, what's the biggest misperception about the Asian American community that you confront in your experience with folks outside the Asian American community? So is there a common misperception or misunderstanding that you run into either in your professional or personal lives? I'll go to Professor Dhingra, then I'll go to Michele Liu, and then Professor Masuoka. I'm going to let you have the last word on misperceptions before we wrap it up. Professor Dhingra.
Well, this is the last thing I'll say. Then I want to again thank you for creating this space for us to come together, and thanks to all the viewers who took time this evening. I'm not sure this is the biggest misperception, but I think it's a meaningful one, if not humorous one. Asian Americans actually can be funny. Asian Americans can actually be creative. Asian Americans, when people do it, when they do well in school, it's not because they're inherently smart. My son, my 9th grade son, really hates it when people compliment Asians because he's like, there's no secret sauce here that we're like, adding. Maybe boba is secret sauce, but that aside, there's no secret sauce that's really kind of leading to anything. So, it's a heterogeneous population, and a lot of the problem, I'll try to be quick, but there's a lot of evidence to support the stereotypes that we see. Small minority notion, you look on TV or you just, people highly educated, we've already talked about this. But once you peel back that one layer, you realize that the diversity really comes to the forefront. And I can go on and on about this, but for the sake of time, I'll stop there.
You tell your son we will affirm the fact that you can be funny, Professor Dhingra. All right, we're here as witness. Michele Liu?
I'm going to go home and tell my son that I am funny. Thank you for that tip.
Yeah.
I think one misconception is that all Asians in Silicon Valley are doing well. We know that's not true. We have to disaggregate the data. We can see that there are subgroups that are struggling economically in terms of their health and their wellness. And so we need to be very cautious about using that model minority term that Pawan mentioned.
And Professor Masuoka, we're going to give you the last word on this misconception that is common or significant in your experience.
So I'm going to take a professional one. I'm a political scientist by training. And the misperception, right, is that Asian Americans are not interested in civics or government or elections. While it is the case that Asian Americans, when you look at the entire adult population, they have a lower turnout rate than, say, white Americans. But what the thing that I think is not seen when you actually dig underneath the surface is that the Asian population are primarily an immigrant population. Over 70% are immigrants. They're not citizens, which means many of them are not citizens and many of them cannot vote, right? So when we actually take into account Asian Americans who are naturalized citizens, right, that rate goes significantly higher. Increasingly, we're seeing over the last few elections is that Asian Americans are the largest growing electorate in American elections today, right? So the exponential growth in the, I think the last number I saw was over 350% growth between 2016 and 2020 in the total number of Asian Americans casting a ballot. And so that kind of hits into this idea of, kind of Asian Americans kind of perpetually being seen as non-American. I think what we're seeing in as a political scientist and we're seeing in politics is that this is a group, even if they were not born in the United States, they are highly invested and highly interested in what's going on in their country.
All right, thank you to all three of our panelists. Truly, thank you, Professor Natalie Masuoka. Thank you, Professor Pawan Dhingra, and thank you, Ms. Michele Liu. Really helpful observations that you were with us to share tonight. Again, my regrets to those whose questions didn't get asked, and there are many, but I will save them and we will hope to fold them into the panels that we have coming on the 20th and 27th of this month. And if you have additional questions that you hope we can ask at subsequent panels, that Q&A function is still open. Please feel free to share your questions there. And finally, I just want to say we can always do better. So please let us know in the Q&A function. Feel free to use that for a comment. What would you like to see done yet again? What would you like to see us change in subsequent panels? The hope is to do a better and better job. And the hope, as I said at the outset, is that by having more conversations like these, we have more understanding and find a way to live and work and prosper together in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, diverse community. Thank you all and have a very good evening. Be well.